panel discussion, which we've organized to coincide with the launch of Bernard de Mello's book, India After Naxalbari. The title itself puts in an unfinished history, and one that is currently unfolding before our very eyes. I think many of you were here less than 2 weeks back when there was this big press conference about the last arrests of human rights activists. And coincidentally, one of them, Vernon, was actually invited to be a part of the panel today, but he can't join us today because he is in the custody of the court right now, and we don't know tomorrow what will happen. So this is the India we live in, and Bernard has tried to trace this history of the last 50 years and see how we have reached where we have reached today, and what are the possible ways that this country can go forward, people's movements can go forward, what can we expect in the economic development and the political scenario over the next few years. In this brief introduction to the book, we have today two panelists who have joined us from far. John Mage, who's come from the US. He's part of the board of the Monthly Review Foundation, which is the publisher of the international edition of the book. John is a very well-known lawyer in the US with a long association of taking up causes of people and people's movements. He's an internationally acclaimed lawyer. He even participated in representing the USSR in cases filed in the US many years ago, and has had a long association taking up cases of political prisoners in the US. So John is now here on behalf of the monthly, he works with the Monthly Review, which has brought out so many different books on so many different topics of economic and social, political importance across the world. John will be one of the panel members. The other is a friend from Delhi, Professor Mohanty, Manoranjan Mohanty. Again, probably needs no introduction to most of you. Professor Mohanty is a very, as distinguished an academician as he has been a distinguished human rights defender and campaigner all these years. I don't know where to start with which part of his the introduction, because Professor Mohanty is one of the founder members or one of the early associates with the PUDR, People's Union for Democratic Rights in Delhi, which has been in the forefront of the struggles for defending human rights, raising issues related to repression on people's movements, raising issues of economic well-being of the masses, whether it was the famous case of the bonded laborers in the Asiad, and so many other issues of workers and people. So Professor Mohanty is there. He's also as well known as an academician. Was with the Delhi University for many years, a very distinguished political scientist and scholar, and well known for his special expertise in China. Professor Mohanty is currently a fellow with the Columbia University. And sorry?
Santa Barbara, California.
California, sorry.
University of California.
Sorry. And Santa Barbara University in California. And Professor Mohanty will also join us. So Bernard, of course, I think all of you know, I don't need to repeat an introduction. So I request all three of them to join us on stage. Bernard, John, and Professor Mohanty. We'll start off this evening's panel discussion with a few words from the author himself. Bernard will give you a brief introduction to the book. Let him say in his own words what inspired him, what was his motivation. These are some of the things he's going to talk about. Bernard? Yeah.
say a few words about, I'll begin by saying a few words about what I'll begin by saying a few words about what motivated me to write this book. I think it happened sometime in the mid-80s when I was associated with the Calcutta radical left weekly Frontier, which was then edited by very famous post-Tagorian Bengali poet Shomar Sen. We were a kind of a collective at that time. We used to help out. That collective included Professor Panther Chatterjee, who is now at Columbia University. As part of this, I happened to make a visit to the district of Gaya in Bihar, and visited a number of areas where the Naxalite movement was active. On this trip, when I was leaving a particular village on my way to the next village, actually, an elderly man insisted on accompanying me right to the outskirts of his village. And he was really elderly. His grandson was, helping him to walk and take him along. And when we came to the outskirts of the city, the time came to say our goodbyes. I really told him, I said that you should not have taken all this effort to come so far with me. And he replied, you have come all the way from Kolkata to learn about us, our lives, our struggles, and our concerns. You care about us. I never forgot this, what this peasant told me. And as I am before you today, I am reminded of, perhaps one of the greatest historians of modern Indian history, Ranajit Guha, Professor Ranajit Guha's Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. And he and this school, for a while actually, and for quite a while, brought out what, in Ranajit Guha's own words, is brought out the small voice in Indian history. The small voice in Indian history. At that time, this was 1983, and I was visiting Gaya in 1985 or so, and when this book was quite fresh in my mind. I was a young person, a student, a PhD student at that time, and basically meeting people on this trip, especially poor peasants, and living in the Dalit tolas of the villages and so on, had a profound effect on me. I realized later through my studies over the years, that, if you look at India, literally hundreds of millions of people have been the victims of Indian capitalism's irrationality, brutality, and inhumanity. And it is the actions of those who cannot remain unmoved and cannot remain inactive in an India where injustice is the rule, where justice is the exception and injustice is the rule. India remains one of the most poverty-stricken countries of the world. Most of its population inadequately fed, miserably clothed, wretchedly housed, poorly educated, and without access to decent medical care. All the result, and this book, I tend to argue, all a result of Indian capitalism's irrationality, brutality, and inhumanity. India's deeply oppressive and exploitative social order is crying out for revolutionary change. It's crying out for revolutionary change. This book basically has a historical perspective, but these 50 years since Naxalbari, so 1967, basically I look at these 50 years over what may be called two phases. One is India's 1968. One is India's 1968. And the other is India's 1989. India's 1968 and India's 1989. The chapter 1, for instance, looks at the first phase of the Naxalite movement. I see this rebellion, the Naxalite rebellion of those times, as part and parcel of a contemporary worldwide impulse among radicals embracing the spirit of revolutionary humanism. Revolutionary humanism was in the air. This was a political and an ethical project that they were undertaking. This decade, this 1968 decade, it's part and parcel of revolutionary humanists coming to the fore in different parts of the world itself. It was a world historic turning point in a way. In the US, for instance, actually, the civil rights movement before that, and then the anti-Vietnam War movement and so on. The Black Panthers actually came on the scene, and the Dalit Panthers in India were inspired by the Black Panthers in the United States. But in different parts of the world, this book shows actually that revolutionary humanism really came to the fore. This revolutionary humanism in India particularly was extinguished, was sought to be extinguished by extraordinary state repression. Extraordinary state repression. There were a number of social movements besides the Naxalite movement that I cover in this book. The civil liberties and the democratic rights movement is covered. The Chipko ecological movement is covered. The Chipko ecological movement is covered. You know, they were crusading Gandhians like Chandri Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna. But there were also ecological Marxists in this movement, something that is not known. That the Chipko movement also had a wing. People like Shekhar Pathak and others, represented the ecological Marxist strand of this Chipko movement. Then, of course, there was the Dalit Panther movement, which was a movement of India's untouchables, inspired by America's Black Panthers. There was also during this time the evolution of women's movements, of the women's movements. This was particularly, it came to the fore with what I think a number of women activists will remember this, and the Mathura rape case actually. The Mathura rape case, especially when the Supreme Court exonerated actually the two policemen who had engaged in a custodial rape of a tribal girl. And this gave rise to the women's movements. So there were a whole lot of militant movements and so on during this time. There were other developments during this time, particularly some events which have not been covered even by historians like Ramachandra Guha in his India after Gandhi. For instance, actually, how the Mizo National Front with Lal Denga as a, this movement, there's a certain silence among historians about this actually. The Indian Air Force actually strafed Aizawl in 1966 actually, on an afternoon actually. So the Indian Air Force attacked its own people in the town of Aizawl in the Mizo Hills actually. So some of these events are also actually covered in this book. All part of India's 1968 and all part of the brutal repression that nationality movements, oppressed nationality movements faced, the Naxalite movement faced. There was also a 20-day railway strike, a historic railway strike in 1974, began I think on May 8th, 1974. It is also covered in this book. So I cover 1968, the 1968 decade in quite a kind of a detail. I am here viewing the past, and I am viewing a past, and we need to remember that the history which has affected all of us, and I'm going back to the colonial period, the history that has affected the Indian peoples and indeed peoples all over the world is actually world history. And we need to have a view of this past. My concern is with this history, a history that has affected all of us, which is actually part of world history. Yes, the ruling classes, they were victorious. There were defeats, there were huge defeats during this period. They were victorious. But we need to call into question every victory of the ruling classes. And I do this, I try to do this in this book. Every victory of the rulers, I call these into question, both past and present. Aspects of the past which ought to be recognized by the present as one of its own concerns. This is what this book really is about. And if I were to actually paraphrase Walter Benjamin, then I would say to articulate the past historically means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. What we are in the present and what is India's 1989. India's 1989, a world historic turning point again actually, beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then a kind of capitalist triumphalism all over the world actually, with the transition back to capitalism in Russia and Eastern Europe and so on, that capitalist triumphalism. But that comes under question with the 2008 great financial crisis. But in India, this kind of capitalist triumphalism still goes on, and it has been accompanied by a particularly vicious ideology, what I call the Indian version of Nazism, which is Hindutva nationalism. So we have today, actually, we are in a moment of danger actually. Danger posed by nationalist Hindutva, the ideology of nationalist Hindutva. We need to retain that aspect of the past which unexpectedly appears at a moment of danger, this moment of danger. And that is that 1968 period of revolutionary humanism. This is what my book tries to do. So this book really divides the period into the 1968 period and then comes to the 1989 period, which is the period of capitalist triumphalism. and the rise of Hindutva nationalism, which is the Indian version of Nazism. I'll just say a few words, if you allow me a little bit of time actually. I want to say a little bit about my analytical approach here. The approach is really interdisciplinary. It's with a historical perspective. I'm focusing on class struggles, but I try now not to lose sight of caste. Caste, with its persistence, its very slowly moving structure over what the French historian Fernand Braudel would call the longue durée. The longue durée. These are notions of historical time, three notions of historical time in Fernand Braudel's work. I would put caste in the longue durée in terms of Indian history. It continues to define, caste continues to define, and it has done over 2 millennia now. It continues to define the culture of exploitation and oppression in India. I have a somewhat detailed appendix on caste in this book, actually, because caste really defines the culture of exploitation and oppression in India. This book really puts together existing knowledge from the library and from the field in new and different ways. It raises questions and offers conclusions which hopefully will help other writers to advance their own researches on India. As regards the conceptual framework, I must mention that I have been deeply influenced by the works of Samir Amin, Hamza Alawi, Ranajit Guha, Nirmal Chandra, Paul Baran, Paul Sweezy, Harry Magdoff, Roy Mauro Marini, this is the Brazilian radical left scholar, Roy Mauro Marini, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Barrington Moore Jr., especially on the chapter on liberal political democracy, the rottenness of Indian liberal political democracy. I draw from the work of Barrington Moore Jr., Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Marx, and last but not the least, Mao Zedong. This book is a comprehension of the present as history, understood as Paul Sweezy understood and undertook this important task. I do it for India, and I'm paraphrasing Paul Sweezy, for the present is still at hand, so we have the power to shape it and influence its outcome. So this is the task I set myself. I see revolution and reform together. Without the Naxalite movement and other progressive movements that were kindled in the 68 period, capitalism in India would by now have turned barbaric. The revolution didn't happen, but it forced reform. One can think of what it takes to grab a chunk of meat from the mouth of a tiger. So revolution and reform goes together. There's not much really more I need to do in terms of introducing this book. But in the last chapter, I go beyond history to memory and dreams, where I imagine a new democracy, And towards the end, I'll read a little excerpt from that last chapter. So with this, let me, we can really open the book and
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you, Bharat. So I'll now request our three guests to formally release the book. I believe it's already sold out. at the table outside, but the publishers assure us that more copies will be at the PPH soon, and it's also available online. Amazon.com and Amazon.in.
Stephen, you say.
No, you do it. It's a book that's been many years in the making, and
Oh, thank you.
I think Bernard has really put a lot of. Well, there's all sorts of things. There's tremendous research. There's an attempt to grapple with theoretical questions. There's emotion, lots of it, but never allowing it to become unreasonable emotion. Everything is argued out. And there's history, there's present, there's past and future. So I really think it's a very comprehensive sort of understanding of history from a different perspective to anything we've seen. And I think Arundhati Roy, as she says in the blurb, this is a history that has remained out of the mainstream. And it's that really the history of what Bernard calls the little voices, I think, which he's trying to bring to the fore. Right at the beginning, Bernard says, in different ways and in changed contexts, India's 1968 is still with us. In the questions it raised about the future and its quest for an egalitarian democratic India. So, to look at both these aspects, what has been India till now, how it's grown, and how do we go forward, both our speakers and the panelists will present different viewpoints and their understandings of these processes, of history and different points in it. So I invite Professor Mohanty. At the end, after the discussion, we'll have a question and answer session. So those of you who have things can jot down your points. We try to keep maximum time for interaction.
Friends, it is indeed a historic moment when present is history. I think that quote from Paul Sweezy, which informs the whole book. In fact, there are two things which recur in this book. One is the small voices and the little voices. That is people's uprisings throughout history, how they challenge oppression, how they challenge establishment. And present as history, how the present embodies challenges of the past and potential of the future and gives the opportunity to the people present to intervene. And that, I think that is the most fascinating way of presenting India after Naxalbari. There have been more than 100 books, really, on the Maoist movement in India. But this book is about India, interpreting India. In fact, that quote from Arundhati Roy, the first part, either it has been ignored. I don't think it has been ignored. It is more misrepresented. And the last 2 weeks' developments in India, which is debating the Maoist links and the issues that are being debated, the so-called urban Naxal phenomenon and so on. It is about really understanding India today. In fact, after reading this book, I felt that after Rajnikanth's India Today, Charles Bettelheim's India Independent, this will be a very important book in that genre, which will be a compulsory reading for understanding modern India. It is that kind of book. Now, there are two things I would like to highlight. One about the 1968 framework. In fact, at least John and I think, Bernard maybe our generation, Elena, and so many are here who would relate themselves to this, the 68ers, that framework. And the other is understanding the nature of the political economy. And he has a very important formulation from the, Paul Sweezy, Samir Amin, Wallerstein, and that whole debate, to which he adds number of new insights. The development of peripheral, semi-peripheral underdevelopment capitalism. Semi-peripheral underdeveloped capitalism, which has created the objective conditions for semi-fascism, that is the Hindutva of today, and the repressive state and the highly overdeveloped state apparatus, a concept that he takes from Hamza Alavi, and which we inherit from the colonial period. So I'll talk a little bit about that second issue. Finally, I would, if time permits, and that is my favorite chapter, the last chapter, reimagining new democracy. I think the 21st century version of new democracy. And here I speak as a political theory student, as someone who has done research on Mao Zedong thought and Chinese revolution, and also as a student of social movements in the world and the researcher on the Naxalbari movement. All these things together help me to formulate some suggestions. First, about the 68 framework. I must tell you my personal experience. When I came back from the US after my PhD, I was in Berkeley, 67 onwards, finished my PhD in 71. I was branded as a new left, US returned Marxist who had given up class analysis and was taking culture, caste, gender, race, superstructure, consciousness more seriously than class, base, and such things. From then on, this to be described as a 68er has not been very comfortable to me, I must confess, Bernard. But this is a fact, that there was a worldwide upsurge and cultural revolution in China. Our movements in Berkeley, Columbia, we were all part of that movement, and throughout the world. But I think Bernard's whole history of people's movements in India from 19th century onwards, he has documented them much before the first war of independence, the tribal revolts and so on. So that it is a continuous process. These little voices or small voices, there is a history against colonialism, against oppression. And that is why someone who takes the Telangana uprising as a reference point for the Naxalbari movement. Therefore, 68 framework should not be seen in isolation from a long historical process. This is very important. But the 68 framework allows us to understand the multiplicity of contradictions and the rise of multiple social movements. That is why the Chipko movement and the peasant movement, the Adivasi movement and the ecological movements, they become connected. The women's movement, particularly in the 70s and 80s, become so integral to what other movements were taking place. Movement in movement, this Elena Sen's famous formulation is about interconnections among social movements. Therefore, the 68 framework allows us to see the multiplicity of ways that imperialism and colonialism, neocolonialism, and capitalism of modern times oppress. What are the new modalities of oppression, how the state and capital form new ways of intervening, dividing, suppressing, or co-opting, or liquidating challenges. That is why the 68 movement is so important. And in the 80s and 90s, this became so important. And the so-called triumphal period of capitalism, the 89 framework. Those are really interesting. These things will stay in our mind. The 68 framework and the 89 onwards. You call it 89, you can call it 91 or whatever framework. This present phase, when capitalism through all kinds of accumulation processes, particularly accumulation by dispossession, and this forms a recurring theme in his third chapter onwards. The displacement, the many ways in which modern capitalism is dispossessing the Adivasis out of land, forest rights, and so on. Therefore, the 68 framework becomes such an important framework. The interconnection among movements. And this also remains a problem both for the Maoist movement as well as for understanding the nature of democracy and resistance in India. In other words, we still have the lack of connections among movements. And it's very interesting. We started with the present as history. The charges against the 5 activists and others are that there is a forcing of the questions, the peasant movement related or Adivasi rights question, the Chhattisgarh question, the Jharkhand movement question, with the Dalit question and the minority question and the nationality question. So the Kashmir question, what Gautam Lavlekar did as a champion of the rights of human rights in Kashmir, and what he, together with all of us, several of us, did in Budia on the workers' rights, peasant rights, what we did on communalism, fighting communalism on that front, and what we did in defending workers' rights or peasant rights. And right to life. Most of these topics are about right to life. So my comment on this interconnection among social movements is that the state, I think, is exaggerating. We need much more solidarity. We need far more interconnection among these movements. And it's very good. The other day in the press conference, in the press club in Delhi, Jignesh Merwani was there. It was good to hear him, and the new solidarity among all these civil liberty and human rights forces is very welcome. And I hope after this onslaught, we have to really remember and understand and comprehend the August onslaught, which we are still going through. Susan was here, tomorrow is here to be in New Delhi for the Supreme Court hearing. So the 68 framework does raise all these questions of putting these issues together and understanding where we have still lacked the mutual solidarity, forging of solidarity among these issues. The Dalit movement issues, the Adivasi issues, the peasant rights issues, the women's movement issues, and above all the ecological issues. Then let us take up his very interesting concept of a semi-peripheral, underdeveloped capitalism. Here, the focus is on capitalism. We have to understand that it is capitalism. And where he also criticizes the formulation of the Maoists. Most of the Maoist groups, some have changed and qualified and have almost come to the formulation that he has on capitalism, but still the CPI Maoists and many others, they still call it semi-feudal. And this is where he has a very interesting analysis, where Indian capitalism, yes, there was some effort to develop capitalism, but it was a weak development in the 1920s. Then in the 1950s, and that is I think I will think more about raising this question. For him, 56, 57 is a very important period. This semi-peripheral, sub-imperialist, underdeveloped capitalism grows after 57. In other words, from 50 to 56, that was an orientation, with land reforms, Zamindari abolition, independent capitalist development. There were some efforts, a commitment to self-reliance and so on. From 57 onwards, the sort of state-supported capitalist development takes place. Then from 91, of course, it is a very different, from late 80s onwards, it's a very different story, the neoliberal, semi-peripheral, underdeveloped capitalism. His point is, from the 1930s onwards, it became clear that capitalist development was not taking place in a very powerful way, but it was taking place. It was taking place on the terms of global imperialism. Capitalism developing on the terms of global imperialism, global capitalism. And therefore the central periphery framework of Wallerstein and the unequal development framework of Samir Amin are put together to suggest this notion of semi-peripheral. It is semi, it is not fully peripheral, because now, especially during the last 20, 30 years, our capitalists are part of the global capital, and some of them are actually sub-imperialists themselves as capitalists and influencing neighbors and not only the capital but also the state and so on. So it is not full-throated, wage labor creation oriented capitalism that has eliminated the feudal forces, and it performs its functions together with upper caste, maintaining the caste order. So there are several pre-capitalist formations and dynamics which continue with this form of capitalism. So therefore, underdeveloped capitalism is the key concept here. Semi-peripheral, underdeveloped capitalism. Here he has a point of difference with the formulation of semi-feudal rural society, because today, the landless and the poor are proletarianized, and you have the rich peasant phenomenon, and they are part of this the underdeveloped capitalism. But it's not a rich peasant in the full modern sense, but it is not feudal or semi-feudal even in the strict political economy sense. And therefore, the differentiation of peasantry, he has very interesting discussion of the old differentiation of peasantry, the Maoist differentiation also, and so on. And today he says that you have a proletarianized, pauperized masses of small peasants and the landless. And so the rural contradiction is very polarized. But the most important formulation here is the polarized society that this peripheral underdeveloped capitalism has created. A polarized society. At least 700 million people, according to really established sources, who do not have secure livelihood. And then you have these islands of wealth of luxury, of absolute, you know, so much luxury fill the rich people's lives, you see. But these islands, and then you have the sea of pauperized population. So it is that he is addressing. It is that he is addressing. That takes me to my point about the. Well, I think I will now talk about the and why the Maoist movement persists. What is the source of its strength, and still why it has failed to win the majority of his poor people's. This is his formulation. It gives the vision of the future, but it has failed to win over the majority of the Indian people. Why? The two explanations that we have got for the persistence of the Maoist movement is that they are raising the right issues, and they are the, I would say, main forces who have exposed the dangers of this polarized society. Because the media is hardly talking about this kind of polarization, of the kind of inequality that we have. Though, you know, in China, you also have growing inequality. The Gini coefficient in China is 46 in 2015. Last year, some people say it was 49. And for India, actually, it is a little less, but very close, and close to America also. In fact, sometimes in some years, in the last 5 years, China has been the highest. So that is and he does talk about you know, the setbacks to socialism in China, how there is a development of capitalism in China. And today there is no model socialist society in the world. Now so the strength of the strength which has sustained the Maoist movement is the reason of the people's issues. At a time when dispossession of tribal land, forest resources, dignity is taking place. And you know, this underdeveloped capitalism is supported by state for establishing factories and mines and big multinational companies' operations in the tribal areas. And so the people are supporting the Maoists because they are defending those basic rights to land, forest, natural resources, and that is the source of it. And unless we really understand the reason behind this situation and only treat the Naxalite movement merely as a challenge to the state and law and order problem and a militant issue and so on, and deploy huge number of security forces to liquidate, and every day we have these encounter killings, bombing operations, prizes and heads and so on. This situation will persist. But the reason why the Maoists have not been able to win over the majority support. In fact, there is a very ironical comment. He says that they lack any perspective on the urban situation, and they have no support among the urban society. And the media is talking about urban Naxals now. It's a very ironical situation. In other words, they are so focused on the agrarian revolution issue that is the serious point. You see, and I agree with him. I think that is not a comprehensive strategy that should emerge from these multiple contradictions, particularly in the light of the digital economy, the new phase of speculative capitalism. He has a very interesting formulation on finance aristocracy, which is the main driving exploitative force of modern capitalism, this semi-peripheral, underdeveloped capitalism. It is finance aristocracy. You know, it's not manufacturing capital owners who are guiding this. It is finance aristocracy. Okay? And globally as well as here. And, you know, finance aristocracy can, you know, create help for the economy immediately in this situation, which we are seeing right now, for example. But another reason is about the strategy. You know, sometimes, and we have all discussed it, we have all written about it, you know, the small squad action, the guerrilla war, the kind of armed struggle which has preoccupied the you know, bulk of the Maoists and so on. In other words, the full comprehensive political strategy where many forms of struggle on many fronts take place, that is not there. So the limitations of overemphasis on armed struggle has to be discussed. Finally, I think why are we talking about all this? What is India not talking about and should? It should talk about democracy. And that is what unites all of us. New democracy is, and in the 21st century it is you know, he has a very beautiful formulation. He talks about multi-party democracy where all the parties share perspectives on new democracy with freedom of conscience as a basic freedom. He talks about, and that is the substitute for what he calls, I mean, a language which I cannot use being a so-called academic. He has 2 chapters with the title, Rotten Liberal Political Democracy. I mean, if I write that, probably tomorrow University of California will not invite me as a visiting professor. But he has that, you know, the guts to say that. Similarly, rotten secularism. I don't know how many minutes more. I should finish now. Okay. Otherwise, I'm tempted to discuss his thesis on this rotten secularism. I will just make 2 quick, 2-3 sentences and conclude. It's not utopia, new democracy, where civil liberties are crucial, where a new vision, where labor is respected and nature is defended and respected, and labor and nature, rather than being expropriated, exploited and destroyed. That is what is happening. Capitalism is exploiting labor and destroying nature. And this is a democracy in which there should be unity among the social movement forces for achieving this. Where poets, artists, writers, social scientists, journalists, and political parties, and revolutionary groups all together see their role together supporting each other. This solidarity of democratic aspirations on every issue, where men and women unite at every level, right up to the global level. And that is the vision. Where religion is respected, but you must not use it as a sectarian tool to suppress minorities, suppress others. He calls it semi-fascist because they don't need to suspend electoral democracy. They have many ways to manipulate electoral democracy. to the media, to many other things. It is semi-fascism because they have many modern ways of managing the mind. They don't have to declare one nation, one race in the same way, even though they try to orient it towards that Hindu supremacy and so on. So it is semi-fascism, it's a rotten secularism that he talks about. Therefore, friends, as I said, it is a very major contribution to our understanding of India, present as history, both in India and globally. Congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Bhonti. Your review in 10 minutes was as comprehensive as the book itself. And I think it really has covered lots and lots of things which the book has talked about in really a short and concise manner. I'm really troubled with how one can classify this book. Is it history? Is it economics? Is it culture? Is it about people's movements? Is it about the politics of the state? And the only conclusion I really have is it's gone into depth on all these issues without becoming too long and too academic to make it difficult to read. And I think that's really something. If a book like this had been around in the 70s and 80s, then maybe other 78ers or the 88ers who are sitting here and debating, is it a semi-feudal, is it capitalism, what is this, is there democracy, is this bourgeois democracy right, should there be a new democracy, what's the role of the national bourgeoisie? All of us perhaps have participated in such debates at different levels and different times. And if a book like this had been around in those days, it would probably have thrown a lot of light on things that we spent so many hours trying to understand and comprehend. With that, I'll now hand over to John.
One of the most interesting things about this book, for a moment, is that Vernon Gonzalez, who is supposed to speak tonight, when he was arrested, there was a thoroughgoing search of his premises. And one of the materials taken was this book. And now, looking at it from the viewpoint of a publisher, one wishes to see a book one publishes read widely. And the most interesting thing about the moment is that this book is now part of the materials which are being considered in the Supreme Court on a matter dealing with the most fundamental democratic rights. One can be proud to have published it, and one should be proud to have written it. I'm not going to talk now about the book, but about a history somewhat different, and that is the Reichstag fire. Looking at this as a lawyer concerned with history. In 1933 in Germany, the Weimar Republic had existed for 30 years. After the German Empire had been defeated in the First War, the new republic formed a federal state guaranteeing basic democratic rights. The police were controlled by the different states. There were elections to be held in all the states. The process by which this democratic state turned into something else, that would make it easier, thank you, was not overnight. It took a slow process. The German word for it was Gleichschaltung, which can be translated as coordination or bringing things into line. In 1930, the world economic crisis hit India, and under the Constitution, the president had the right to rule by decree in times of emergency. And the decrees that they used first were to introduce, at a time of economic distress, severe budget control, no state aid. This caused ever-increasing tension. People who had lost everything had no way of even getting by. And the bourgeois parties that in the center controlled and dominated the republic lost their votes. They lost them in two directions. They lost them to the left, to the communists, and they lost them to the right, to the Nazis. The Nazis, in this democratic period, when they were contesting elections, actually attempted to deal with the distress of the people suffering from the Depression. And the stormtroopers were initially a kind of employment for people who couldn't get employment otherwise. And they constituted a form of social charities for the families of these people, because the state was not providing them. They built a structure. In 1930, in the election, they suddenly appeared out of nowhere with 20% of the vote. In 1932, there were two elections. They got 30% of the vote in each. They did not win a majority in the parliament because Germany had proportional representation. But they were by far the largest party. Unable to form a government, but neither was anybody else. So the president, an old general named Hindenburg, was continuing to rule by decree with right-wing ex-army officers who he knew, but who had no base in the parliament. Two governments came and fell without any basis. The only thing that's important for our story right now is that one of these governments took the elected government of Prussia, which was the biggest state. And remember, the states had control of the police. It had 60% of all the police in Germany. And under a decree by the president, put it under direct control. Then in January 30th, 1933, the president turned to Hitler to take over the government. He persuaded the president by saying he wanted only two posts for the Nazis. The Interior Ministry, which in Germany at that point, remember, the police are under local control, did not amount to quite as much as it otherwise would, and a minister without portfolio, the number 2 Nazi, Goering, who became, however, the Minister of the Interior in the state of Prussia, which you recall had 60% of the police. That was on January 30th. On February 4th, they issued a decree, prepared by a prior government but not issued. Decree for the protection of the German people. Censor the press, the power to. Ban public meetings, the power to. And permit 3 months of protective custody. That is, before a court or police, the court could force the police to come up with a charge or not. In the next 2 weeks, 50,000 stormtroopers were added to the Prussian police as extra police. On the 24th, the headquarters of the Communist Party was raided. And they claimed, we now know falsely, that they found plans for an armed rebellion to be set off by attacks on public buildings. On February 27th, the Parliament of Germany, the Reichstag, burst into fire. That evening they announced that it was caused by the communists, and on February 28th, mind you now, an election had been called for March 5th. On February 28th, they issued a decree for the protection of the people and state against communist acts of violence, suspending the basic rights, freedom of speech and assembly, and warrants necessary for searches. Second, they gave them the right to remove all state governments. "4,000 people were arrested, leading communists, all the communist members of the Reichstag, many trade union leaders, outspoken civil libertarians, brought to SA barracks, beaten, tortured, some killed. Under these circumstances, the March 5th election was held, and it was a free election. And the Nazis did not win a majority, even after all of that. But there were 81 communist deputies who were elected, and on March 6th, a new decree abolished the Communist Party and made them not eligible to take part in the parliament. On March 23rd, the Reichstag met and passed what was called an Enabling Act. It granted the parliament the right to enact laws, or rather the government, that is, Hitler and his ministers, the right to enact laws without the parliament. Let's go back to the word Gleichschaltung. Bringing into line a whole society that a minority, a large minority, 30% of the votes, wishes to impose upon it. What happened? On March 31st, all state parliaments were suspended. On April 7th, governors were appointed for all the states. On April 7th, a law, now, not just a decree, a law, for the restoration of the civil service, the power to remove all school teachers, professors, judges, prosecutors, and prohibiting all communists and all Jews from participating in any of those posts. That's all the public employees. On May 2nd, trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labor Front. The German Labor Front created an organization that translates as Strength Through Joy, which took under its control all voluntary organizations, chess clubs, football clubs, singing choirs, had to meet the requirements of this large movement headed by a small group of powerful people that could poll 30% of the votes. The government brought a case against the people who they claimed to have set fire to the Reichstag as an attempt to demonstrate to the many German people who are not members of that 30%, but others, that what they were doing was lawful, proper, and a response to the threat of an armed communist rebellion. A great movement took place outside Germany, with help inside, to conduct a parallel trial So I'm saying, from the point of view of a lawyer now, this is late in the game. This is after much of the damage had been done. How was the story to be told to the world? The defendants were the leader of the communists in the Reichstag, 3 Bulgarian communists who were in the city, and 1 Dutchman who was found in the Reichstag when it was burning with his shirt off, being used as a flame or something like that. Turgler, the head of the Communist Party in Germany, in the Reichstag, had a solid alibi. He was nowhere near the place. The 3 Bulgarians had just arrived town before the day. No question they were not there either. This young Dutchman, by the time he turned up in court, was a drooling idiot. Could not say a word. Under the German legal system, the defendants had the right to question witnesses, something that in the American and British system is not possible. It was important because the Nazis assigned the lawyers to the defendants, and the defendants used the right. One in particular did, a Bulgarian communist named Dimitrov. The London parallel trial showed that the Reichstag was underlaid with tunnels which had only 3 points of entrance. 1, a powerhouse. The second, the president of the Reichstag's residence, which was Goering, the head of the Prussian police. And the third was into the Reichstag itself. The proofs of the trial showed that the fires were set in 11 different places using flammable substances. The trial in London pointed out to the world with supporting proofs that the Dutchman who they found there could not have set the fire himself, and that it was the Nazis who had done so. And the court, and perhaps the last such instance where this was possible, because the proofs had been shown to the whole world, acquitted Torgler and the 3 Bulgarians, convicted the drooling Dutch boy, beaten senseless, and executed him. And ruled that even though they acquitted them, it was the communists who had started the fire. Let us make 4 points now, quickly. The communists were, in fact, unarmed. There were no armed communists in Germany. There was no armed communist resistance. And in fact, as a good Marxist would say, there is a dialectical connection here. If they had been armed, they would not have dared do what they did. The Nazis were a national party. There were no parts in Germany where they weren't present in some strength, though there were places where they were stronger than others. Germany itself was an imperial country and had benefited from imperialism. There had been many peasants in Germany before industrialization, but they did not form a large, unemployable mass because they emigrated through the United States into lands where the native inhabitants had been murdered. And in fact, the German people, including the working people, had benefited to some degree from the benefits of the global imperial system. And let's make a last point. The left did not unite against the Nazis, not before this, And not until this very trial that we're talking about, a year after all of this had taken place. Now let's return to Bernard's book for a second. Yes, it is the case that democratic rights will not stop a movement backed by capital, and the Nazis at the end were backed by German capital. They had means of manipulation, they had means of persuasion. This is the days of radio, movies, and they had a brilliant manipulator of all of that, Goebbels. But to be in control down to the chess clubs, that required something else. And what they did. Let us then hope that unity in the defense of fundamental democratic rights is something that will not have to await the complete destruction of all of the organizations which give meaning to independent political life and thought among lawyers and intellectuals and the rest of us. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for a very brief and very educative depiction of how the Nazis came to power and how the right wing consolidated itself in Germany. I think a lot of us may have read lots of books, but this 15-minute snapshot of the events leading up to the Reichstag fire and trial is really vividly put forward to us. A context maybe to see contemporary developments in the world. The book itself, I think, also takes the same approach, that we have to learn from history if we have to relive it. And it's a happy coincidence, I think, that we are sitting here 50 years from the 68 that Bernard depicts as one of the turning points. And in the course of conversation with Bernard and a friend this afternoon, I was wondering, how will the world look at 2018, 50 years from now? Most of us perhaps won't be there to understand, to see what will history record as this year. But there are so many different things that we can see happening, which are happening in history, which happened in history earlier. Perhaps the significance of those minor events not so apparent when they are actually taking place, and over a period of time they develop. So even as though we are all occupied so much with the trial of the 5 human rights activists, it's hogging media headlines and other things, I think there's also a lot of hope in some certain small little developments that have happened. In the last month, for example, even while headlines of news has been full of this, 2 major universities where the student elections were fought, the left forces have defeated the ABVP in elections. There's the Punjab University, which happened about 20 days ago, where the SFS, which was a coalition group of various shades of left students, came out triumphant. Perhaps it never made news outside of Punjab. Those who see internet and WhatsApp messages may have heard about it. The GNU, of course, has been hogging the headlines for a long time, so elections there was headline news, it's been on TV, and these things are happening. So both trends we see happening in India today. And we also see what perhaps nobody is really talking about. There's the political state getting more and more powerful. There's the ideological battle which Bernard has talked about, the secular or the pseudo-secular state, the rise of right-wing. These are all questions which I'm sure all of you have a lot of things to ask our panelists. So at this stage, throw it open for comments, for questions. Keep it brief, please, because I'm sure lots of people would like to have a say. So, those of you who would like to ask some questions, anyone?
Can you explain the pseudo part of the secularism? This is a very controversial.
Secular state is the name of
Secular state.
I'll have to first define secularism. The state is secular. The state is secular if it guarantees individual and corporate freedom of religion. 2, treats the individual as a citizen irrespective of his or her religious affiliation. 3, does not constitutionally identify itself with any particular religion, and neither promotes nor interferes with any religion. In other words, separation from religion. Now, I'll not go into any detail, but there's one aspect actually here. Religious organizations in India have influenced the functioning of the state in matters of civil law and in education. If the state in India was secular, it would have by now, 7 decades after independence, phased out all religious, caste and community codes and brought in a universal secular uniform civil code. But beyond that, actually, in this chapter, actually, I look at 3 pogroms which took place in independent India. 3 in particular, there were other pogroms also. One is Bombay 1993, January 1993 Bombay. Before that, Delhi 1984, and then Gujarat 2002. And I indict the state on 3 counts. These 3 counts, you'll find this in this chapter 7, I don't want to go into any detail. But that, I think, more than ever brings out how the Indian state, and secularism here of the Indian state is rotten at the heart. Rotten at the heart.
If I can add, I think he has a very important formulation on religion, talking about human foundation of religion. And what has happened is that under the state policy and the kind of development we have experienced, instead of really building the human foundation of religion through secular and the communitarian experience, we have done just the opposite. We have reduced the human foundation and turned religion as a basis of utilization of society and assertion of very narrow ends. I think this, therefore, the common perception that, secularists, Marxists, communists, they're anti-religion, that whole debate has to be recast. The debate on religion has to be recast, and he gives us very interesting, from Marx to now, he has a very good discussion he gives us some good insights to handle that.
Just to add to that, I think you should read it along with the chapter on the liberal political democracy also being brought in. So where Bernard has argued on the basis of various theoretical expositions of what constitutes liberal democracy, why the Indian state doesn't match up to those standards. And secularism is an extension of that core argument, if I'm right.
So, I wanted to clarify one very important point, Bernard, when you talked about two bits. One is this question of semi-fascism. I think because it's so complex, analyzing the whole phenomenon of fascism, the difference, the variety we have in India with what was in Germany, and we see a possibility as I said with this Hindu fascist threat. So now we definitely have a threat of fascism. But from your analysis, India will go from the colonial era, we go to the 50s, go to the 70s. Do you think, I mean, in a way we can say that we are likely to face a threat of actually our state going fascist, or it's very complex with our present economic crisis, with our present parliamentary bourgeois system, that we can really collapse and can be dead. It's just one of the points. The second point, briefly also, you touched about the question of why the Maoist movement failed. Is it also a question of this lack of the mass line, of actually making a correction of mass line itself, or is it more complex than that? These are my two questions. First.
See, this thing about semi-fascism, yeah, I need to get to the gist of it actually. I think Professor Mohanty got to the core of it actually, that in the chapter 9 of my book actually, I have a section on classical fascism. Classical fascism as it took place in Italy and Germany. And I see that as a guide to understanding this phenomenon of fascism. But I think we need not actually have to read too much into it and keep the phenomenon as it unfolds. We need to be open-ended also about it here. Semi-fascism in the making in India encompasses an authoritarian democratic regime. Now here, authoritarian democratic regime, you might think it's a contradiction in terms, but this is, in Italy actually there was, I think his name was Giovanni Gentile. Actually on behalf of Mussolini, actually he was actually the chief ideologist of the fascization of Italian culture, Giovanni Gentile, and he propounded this idea of authoritarian democracy. Now, if I were to go to, I can go into detail on what it implies, but this you'll find in chapter 9 of my book. So, a semi-fascism in the making in India encompasses an authoritarian democratic regime and a sub-imperialist power, with the regime maintaining a close nexus with big business, nurturing and supporting the Hindutva nationalist movement to the extent of being complicit in its criminal acts, and insisting on controlling its necessary enemies with the use of terror. These necessary enemies, as you know, Muslims, oppressed nationalists, oppressed nationality movements, and Maoists. So this is my conception of semi-fascism. I use the term semi-fascism because I think that money and naked power has actually hollowed out the democratic potential in India actually. Money, and here in recent times actually corporate funding of elections. It has hollowed out the potential that we have as the Indian people, the potential to bring in an authentic and a genuine democracy. So, so in this kind of a sort of a context, it's not necessary actually for a Hindutwadi nationalist regime to actually overthrow bourgeois democracy. They can still maintain the whole electoral system and yet institute elements of fascism. And this is what I call semi-fascism. Regarding, no, there's one more.
Bernard, I was wondering if John wants to add something to the concept of semi-fascism and fascism as it developed, since he's got a very deep study of that period.
Yeah.
Just before we go on to the next question.
Actually, I thought that Bernard dealt with that brilliantly. I really don't have anything to add at all. Though I would add a comment that Professor Manti had said to me earlier, a person saying this upcoming election next year, that it might result not in 5 years of more power, but 50.
That's a good comment. Excuse me, may I ask you something?
Sorry, we have a second question.
What in your view is the lesson we in India have to learn from the Reichstag fires and the 1933 elections in Germany? Is there anything we should learn or we should know about that?
I'm not sure I understand.
No. Is there anything that we should learn from the Reichstag fire?
Oh, yes.
And from the 1933 election
Right.
in Germany?
That the institutions of legality, bourgeois democracy, offer no internal guarantees that they will not be subverted by a movement that is determined to do so. That's the core lesson. The law in itself is never going to, independent of the persons who administer it, protect anything.
Yes, second question. One more. Yes, you can move on to Harsh's.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm not very sure about what you are trying to get at in this second question. But what you imply is that, if I've understood you correctly, is the failure to implement what in Maoism is called the mass line is responsible for the failures of the Maoist movements. Are you saying that? I'm not really arguing anything of that kind actually. I'm not really arguing anything of that kind. Let me be very clear. In fact, I'm not even making or let me put it this way. I do understand, and in concrete terms, I have made certain criticisms actually of the Maoist movement. And with respect to this mass line, there is, if you look at the constitution of the CPI Maoist, the CPI Maoist has a constitution. Article 59 of this constitution actually deals with how the relation between the party and the mass organizations. Relation between the party and the mass organizations. And here what this article specifically says is that there will be a party fraction within the executive committee of all the mass organizations, and the view on important matters actually the view of this party fraction will prevail. Now this is something I have criticized actually. I have criticized in chapter 7 of my book. I've made a critique of this, drawing on actually the Maoist experience in China itself during its war of liberation. So this is what I have done. But I don't conclude the way you have concluded. I look at things concretely and specifically and don't make any kind of generalizations of the kind you are making.
In a paper I read, they had said, ecological movements and environmentalism are truly the secular faith. That was the phrase used. And the paper goes on to say, people from various classes, religions come on a platform and it's the environment or ecology. I just want your comments on that. This being the true sort of secular faith, environmentalism.
You want to say that
Your views on ecological movements, environment.
it's very important, both in my book, Red and Green, and also in his. I think the importance of ecological dimension of revolutionary programs is very important. Is very critical, and this had not been a central part before. So classical Marxism, I think Rosa Luxemburg had herself talked about the ecological. In fact, why capitalism becomes barbarian is it destroys, nature, natural resources. Not only dehumanizes labor and exploits labor and so on. Now, therefore, this interconnection of the ecological question and the labor question, the peasant question. In fact, in the peasant question itself, now ecological dimension becomes very critical. So, and this is why, when I was summarizing the new democracy, reimagination of new democracy, the ecological program becomes a very important component in the present context of new democracy. That is all that I am suggesting.
Vernon, you mentioned in your talk earlier that you have a separate section dealing with caste. I think caste is an important dimension of understanding this whole thing. When you say, I think you rightly speak of semi-fascism because caste is a double-edged thing in India. And in fact, caste, while it can be also disruptive, it can also actually be a protector in some sense because it will prevent unnecessary autocratic authoritarianism kind of emerging within the country. So I think one has to view caste from that perspective. It plays both ways. So the power of the, let's say the Dalit movement or other lower castes who kind of can be a very powerful at the hustings during elections. I think that kind of balances out the emergence of a complete fascist state, for example, in India. I think one needs to bring in that element within the analysis. I've not read the book, so I don't know what you have written on the caste dimension, but I think this is something which, this is a comment I thought would be useful to engage with.
I don't think I would agree with you, but I would still keep an open mind on what you say. But I really don't think I would agree with this appendix on caste. Actually, which from a Marxist point of view, I think caste determines access to the means of production. So if you are a Rajput or a Bhumihar, the chances are that you will have a greater access to the means of production. And what the state makes available in terms of green revolution inputs and so on and so forth, also included in the means of production. Caste also structures the relations of production. Caste also structures the relations of production. So in this appendix I have tried to show while caste is a socio-religious institution, it strongly influences access to the means of production. And in India particularly land as an important means of production actually. As also it structures the relations of production. These things. But caste, I don't know, as a Marxist, I am deeply influenced by Dr. Ambedkar and what Dr. Ambedkar has written on caste and what he has written on graded inequality, this phenomenon of what he has called, this is in the appendix actually, this phenomenon of graded inequality and how this divides and degrades human beings actually. I don't see anything worthy of retaining in this whole caste system. I sincerely and deeply hope, and this was Ambedkar's dream, that caste needs to be annihilated, lock, stock and barrel.
Yeah, I agree with that, but the question is regarding how caste is actually being used as a political tool to kind of will provide some protection to the lower caste groups and the lower classes who also happen to be the lower caste.
I think.
Sorry, I just, if you are suggesting that Dalit movement is an important part of the democratic struggles, the democratic forces against authoritarianism, fascism and repression, I would say yes. And especially in the context of the Ambedkar formulation, and this is an important note that the appendix and also in the text. Caste is not merely an ideology; it is a social institution, and he just now stated it. How it determines access to means of production and also influences relations of production. In other words, if you just fight Brahmanism ideologically, that's not enough. In addition to ideological battles, you have to take measures about land, about access to means of production. So you have to have a anti-caste or caste annihilation program at superstructure as well as base level. And Dalit movement, if it is only a reservation movement, yes, reservation we need, we defend, but it is part of the, defense of the rights of the oppressed caste today until caste is annihilated. So this is a transitional stage, reservation. Otherwise, caste is a pre-modern or exploitative category as an institution. That of course we have to accept. So did you mean that Dalit movement is a democratic movement?
I fully agree that caste has to be annihilated.
Yes.
But it has become a very powerful tool in the hands of the regional parties, for example, which can actually subvert the fascist movement within the country, the Hindutva, for example.
To the extent that actually the left allies with the Ambedkarite movement, the Dalit movement actually. See, the Dalit movement, the real positive aspect of this movement is the struggle for human dignity, the struggle for human dignity. And whereas the left, when it looks at it, the left actually stresses the aspects that I have just mentioned. this institutionalized inequality of the caste system, determining the access to the means of production, structuring the relations of production and so on. I think the two dimensions here need to come together. There's a desperate and there's a crying need for unity of the Dalit movement with the left movement. And that certainly will be a very positive factor in taking on semi-fascism.
I think Bernard has also touched on this in different aspects of narration in the book. Because there's a very interesting analysis of Bihar in the first phase of the Naxalite movement, where Bernard takes the caste composition of some of the leaders of that struggle. Ushari?
This is the Bhojpur movement.
Bhojpur movement. The
Bhojpur movement. Yeah.
And tries to see how at that stage there was such a unity of the lower and middle castes against what was then a very sharp and feudal oppression of all so-called lower castes. And Bernard makes another interesting point, I think, which is relevant to this discussion, which is that the history of India has been one of reforms forced by revolutionary movements. So the revolutionary movements may have been defeated by repression, but they bring in certain reforms from above to try and keep this unity at bay. And he's discussed this at some length also in different parts of the book. So perhaps it's not just looking at caste in isolation, but trying to link it to the movements of below and what they are trying to do, the strategies of the rulers to prevent unity and so on. I think that is also relevant to it.
The caste system brings in a lot of prejudices between the castes. The caste system creates a lot of social prejudices towards each other actually. And in that process, it prevents the unity from emerging of the oppressed people in general, rather than specifically with related to caste actually. So there is a caste exploitation is there, but there is also a general exploitation of the people actually, working people actually. But their unity, in that unity, the caste prejudices and those kind of things, unless something is done about that, it's very difficult to bring them together. That's what I feel. I don't know. I have, at some point, I have gone through that experience.
Any other questions? So before we wind up, I think Bernard wants to read a small extract from the book today's discussion. Thanks to all of you for coming and to our two guests for throwing a lot of light on different aspects of the book and giving us context in which to read and understand it.
If you'll bear with me for about three minutes or so, I just want to read the last 2-3 paragraphs of this book.
Switch on the mic.
Yeah, it's on.
I am an old-fashioned socialist who continues to insist that wealth comes from the exploitation of human labor and the appropriation of nature. To paraphrase Marx, but also to bring in the importance he assigns to ecology, I would like to emphasize the point about capitalist wealth originating in the exploitation of labor and the appropriation of nature in the process of production. And I'm paraphrasing and adding something to what Marx wrote in Capital Volume 1. Capital is dead labor and out-of-play nature that vampire-like lives only lives by sucking living labor and extant nature, and lives the more labor and nature it sucks. At the heart of what I have been stressing about India's semi-peripheral, underdeveloped capitalism is what I have called monstrous class polarization. Islands of wealth, luxury and civilization in a vast sea of poverty, misery and degradation. By no stretch of imagination can the sea enjoy equal citizenship and partnership in the process of democratic decision making alongside the islands. In the absence of economic emancipation of the majority, political emancipation is a far cry. The people's struggle for economic and political emancipation, indeed human emancipation, and how they can realize this goal is the problem of India. The rotten liberal democratic regime, however, couldn't care less. It seems to be taking on semi-fascist traits and assuming the position of a sub-imperialist power in South Asia, even as hundreds of millions of Indians continue to be relegated to irrelevance. What then of the prospect of new democracy? Very dim, unless at some point the soldiers and armed policemen in the employ of the state reckon that the people might win, and so they join the masses in revolt. I hope to live to witness the times when those hundreds of millions of Indians, relegated to irrelevance, heeding the small voices of history and the present as history, decide to enter history on their own terms. Society, after all, is a human creation, subject to human influence. And so, a society of equality, cooperation, community, and solidarity is still possible.